Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Battlefield 3 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. Now there's probably a few questions you have going through your head right now, the first of them being, what the hell DW, why are you reviewing this? You said you weren't going to review it. Well, yes, I did say that. About a year and a half ago or something like that. And eventually the massive hype died down for it and people stopped pestering me about it, and so I became fairly lukewarm towards Battlefield 3. At first, it was just, I was so tired of people bothering me about it, and I knew that the hatred was going to be immense if I did a review of it back then. So I just held it off until now. Second thing, I got extremely bored. To the point where I was just sitting there playing games that I really should have been enjoying, and I wasn't. Because for some bizarre reason, I just had this hankering for a multiplayer FPS, and I wasn't getting it, so of course, Battlefield 3. Big multiplayer FPS, right? So I got it, and don't worry, I didn't pay full price for it. It was on sale. So, it wasn't like I paid a huge amount of money for this thing. But the real question here is not so much, did I go back on my word for saying I wasn't going to review it, and because of all sorts of things. I still think that EA is up to no good with Origin and everything, don't get me wrong. But I can put that aside, because I had to use Origin to review Mass Effect 3. And from what I used, it wasn't that bad. I can put up with it long enough to review something. And so, here you go, Battlefield 3 review. So what is Battlefield 3? It is a first-person shooter by DICE that was released in October of 2011. And they billed it as a PC-led game. As in, the primary platform was PC. Turns out they switched that mid-development to, I believe, PlayStation 3. And it kind of shows in a lot of ways. But in other ways, not as much. And I'll get to that in a moment. But this is the first numbered sequel after Battlefield 2. Of course, 2142 doesn't really count. That was kind of a spin-off. But people were really looking forward to a true sequel to Battlefield 2. So the real question here is, did Battlefield 3 live up to that expectation? And did it deliver what made Battlefield 2 great, only with a more modern twist or something like that? Or did it go the Bad Company 2 route and just kind of consoleize everything, and there you go? Well, let's find out. Which brings me to the presentation, which is kind of a sticking point for me. They announced at the beginning of the development phase that they would have the PC as the primary platform. It's not. I believe PS3 is, actually. They switched it mid-development, and they officially confirmed that at one point. And it kind of shows, even though this does require DirectX 1011, which means you cannot run it on XP at all. It runs only on Windows Vista or 7, which is another issue I have. But it's running in DirectX 1011 only. And to be honest with you, I don't really notice any difference from DX9. It doesn't look any better than Bad Company 2 did in the highest settings possible to DirectX 9. It just has some slightly better post-processing effects, and that's kinda it, actually. It does have some really nice post-processing effects, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of really great high-end effects where when you, say, shoot things and all sorts of dust flies up, and there's tons of particle effects and everything. So you've got all this stuff flying up, and then you can't see anything. That's the big problem with the graphics. They make it really, really hard to actually see anything that you're doing. So the weird thing about this game is, it actually is easier to play at lower graphics settings because you don't have as much stuff obscuring your vision. And on top of that, it's easier to actually see things at the lower detail settings because the bloom lighting isn't as intense. I mean, when you've got this thing on the high settings, it outright blinds you. You can't see anything in this game, and it's really irritating. And even if you could see things, what you would find is that while the modeling and animation are surprisingly well done, considering what happened with Bad Company 2, while the modeling was still great in that, but the animations looked ridiculous and they were clunky looking, and they really upped the ante with them in this one that looks a lot better. And they finally put in a separate animation for reloading when you don't have an empty magazine. It's finally, right? it took them long enough. But that is nice to have these nice fluid animations and the nice modeling. But the textures themselves are just kind of eh. Even on the highest settings you can put them on, they don't look all that great. They look okay, don't get me wrong. They look like a fairly decent modern game. But it's not the high-end stuff you would expect from a full PC game. And that's kind of a disappointment. And so what you end up having is modeling animation that are very well done, texture quality that's kind of eh. And in a lot of cases, on the environment, it actually is pretty bad. Even on the highest settings, you would see some really low-res textures, and they really pop out when you notice them. And it's just kind of weird having to go into this thing and seeing all this stuff on the high settings and saying, oh, well, the effects are nice, but I can't see anything, so I have to lower the settings in order to actually be able to play it. It's really annoying, particularly with the lighting effects. But then you go to the sound design, and as ever, the sound effects are wonderful in this game. Really high-end sound design that even the voice acting is well done. It fits the game pretty well, and there's nothing that sounds completely ridiculous in it. But, well, I guess you could say the announcer and your voice when you're playing as Russians in the multiplayer, which just sounds ridiculous. It doesn't even really sound like a Russian accent. It sounds more French than anything else. But, voice acting's well done. The sound effects to give you this great sense of the battle raging around you. It's hard to describe, really. You really have to hear it for yourself to understand. Now, I do think that the first-person weapon sounds when you're actually shooting yourself don't sound very good. They just sound kind of wimpy and underpowered, but when you're listening to it around you, it's much, much better. You hear that nice crack of rifle fire and stuff like that just really gets you into this mood of combat. But then there's the music, which is bad. They completely butchered the Battlefield theme. They turned it into basically dubstep. It sounds awful. And that's kind of how the whole soundtrack is to this game. It's not very good. So that's kind of a shame, because the previous games didn't have amazing soundtracks, don't get me wrong, but that theme was very iconic. And it's just sad to see it go from this iconic, very catchy theme to just noise. So that's a bit of a problem. But it's not really the presentation that matters the most, even though that's what a lot of people would have you believe. No, what really matters, the story and the gameplay, and the story in this game is complete garbage. You play mostly as a guy named Blackburn, who's a U.S. Marine being interrogated by a couple of guys who are convinced he's guilty of something that you don't really figure out until later on. And that is that there were these weapons found in Iran. There was a case of supposed to be 3 of them, but 2 of them were missing. So they're like, where are the other 2? Where are the other 2? And the entire story is basically told in flashbacks, where Blackburn is recounting his story of how he came across these things and what ended up happening in the aftermath of that. And he's recounting these tales to these 2 guys. And at one point, they ask him what his relationship was with this pilot, and he even goes, "Who? I don't even know this person." And so then the game proceeds into a jet fighter sequence that is completely pointless to the storyline. So at that point, you are completely aware that the storytelling in this game is just completely inept. There's nothing good about the storytelling in this game at all. It's completely cliched. The story itself is complete garbage. You don't give a crap about any of the characters or any of the things going on, because it's so absurd and completely unrealistic, even though they're trying to pass it off as realistic, that it just comes across as the most absurd Michael Bay fantasy you can basically imagine. And it ends up involving the U.S. versus Russia, again. Only it starts out with the U.S. Marines being in Iran. Oh joy, right? So, the campaign itself, the storyline is terrible, but the gameplay is even worse, because it's the extremely linear campaign. A lot of it is actually a rail shooter sequence, and so you get the feeling the entire time you're playing that it might as well be something like House of the Dead, a complete rail shooter, because the game is just so linear. It doesn't let you do anything. You want to try to flank an enemy? Nope, can't do that. You want to try to go a different route? Nope, can't do that. You try to go a certain way, return to the combat zone. It's stuff like that that just makes the campaign in this game just almost unbearable. But it's made completely unbearable by the ridiculously awful checkpoint system, where if you're being shot at when it saves at checkpoint, guess what? You're going to load the game and you're going to still be shot at. So you might have to restart the whole level. It's stuff like that that makes the campaign absolutely terrible. So don't even bother with the campaign. But luckily there are two other segments of this game, co-op and multiplayer. Now, before I venture into those, I have to mention Battle Log, which I've been avoiding up through the single player bit, but it does actually factor into it somewhat. When you buy this game on PC, you have to go through this thing called Origin, which I've mentioned before. I hate Origin. It is terrible. But basically, you have to activate this thing on Origin. It's EA's equivalent of Steam, only nowhere near as good. And you end up going through that to play the game. This wasn't really a problem with Mass Effect 3, but in Battlefield 3 it becomes a problem because when you launch the game through Origin in Battlefield 3, it brings you to this thing called Battle Log. It opens your web browser and brings you to a web page. It logs you in, and you have to activate the game through that. What I mean by that is, you can choose to play campaign, co-op, or multiplayer through Battle Log. You can't just start the game and play it. You have to go to a website first, and then play it. And to do this, you just, like for campaign, you just click on play campaign, and then it brings you to a page, and then you click launch campaign, and it will bring up the single player portion of the game. That's not a huge problem, but it's still annoying. Co-op, you go into it, and you can either move in buddies from your friends list over and say, hey, you want to join this thing, or invite them to your game or something like that. You can play with up to one buddy, and otherwise you're going to have to go through public matchmaking. I've never managed to get the public matchmaking to work. Ever. So I don't know what's wrong with it, I don't know whether it's just me, but I've never managed to get it working, so you're going to have to play it with a buddy. Which is how I'd recommend playing it anyway. But the co-op itself is just a bunch of missions that pretty much follow single-player guidelines, only they're done with a buddy. And there are a few variations here and there, like there's one mission where you're able to fly a helicopter, and one of you is flying the helicopter, the other one's the gunner. So that's kind of cool. But if you don't have someone who's flying the helicopter who's competent with it, then you're going to crash, and it's really annoying. So that's something to keep in mind. But otherwise, it's a fairly simple system, and the more points you get in that, the more stuff you actually unlock for the multiplayer. So if you want to go for the entirety of the unlock system, you have to play the co-op. For instance, the first thing you unlock is the MP412 Rex revolver, and the last thing you unlock is the G3 assault rifle. So, stuff like that. But that's all done through Battle Log, and the matchmaking doesn't work, like I said. But then you get to the multiplayer. Now, before I go into the multiplayer, the Battle Log system is not only for the launching of campaign or co-op, it's also a stat tracking system. It keeps track of all of your stuff from the multiplayer, which is nice if you like that sort of thing. I'm not really into this whole stats thing, but it is a pretty good stat tracker, I'll give it that. But you also have to go through the server browser, or the just quick join system from Battle Log. The server browser in Battle Log is actually pretty good, I'll give it that. But at the same time, you sit there wondering why they couldn't have just put it in the game. Why can't you just start the game up and go to the server browser from within it? None of this makes any sense, requiring Battle Log to play the game. I can see it being a secondary thing, but still. Anyway, when you actually go into the multiplayer, you will find that it's got a lot of similarities with Bad Company 2. In fact, that's what it takes most after. And what I mean by that is, it brings back, of course, the Conquest mode that you're used to from the Battlefield series. I'm not going to go into detail about that because I've gone over it before. But it also brings back Rush, Squad Deathmatch, variations of Conquest, like Conquest Assault and Conquest Domination. It has large modes of that, so you can play up to 64 players on a server, which I don't personally recommend it unless you have a really beefy computer, because 64 players tends to run pretty badly and be fairly laggy, so just fair warning there. And the maps generally aren't designed for 64 players anyway. They're mostly designed for 32 or lower. So that's something else to keep in mind. But it also adds in new game modes as well. I mean, you've got fairly standard stuff, Team Deathmatch, you've got the other modes that you're used to from the Battlefield series and Bad Company 2. And then you've also got new modes that were added in through expansion packs, or I should say DLCs, because that's really what they are, that you can get through the premium service, which, unfortunately, the premium version is pretty much required for this game. I say that because most servers don't run the base maps only anymore. They run a few of the maps from, say, Back to Karkand, or a few of the maps from Close Quarters. They don't necessarily run only the base maps anymore, so you have a hard time joining them. It's a real pain. So I ended up having to get the premium edition of this game to actually experience it to its full extent. But the stuff they add in with these expansion packs includes stuff like Gunmaster, which is basically just gun game, only it takes 2 kills to advance to the next tier. And they added in a new one with the latest expansion, which is latest DLC, which is Aftermath, and that would be Scavenger mode, where when you're running around, you start out with a pistol and nothing else, and you have to pick up a weapon as you go through the level, and it's just a kind of a conquest mode otherwise. But it's still the same combined arms style of gameplay, where it's infantry, armor, and air vehicles as well. And they brought back jets from Battlefield 2, which brings with it the same exact problem that happened in Battlefield 2 with the jets. Dogfighting. That's all people do in the jets. And, of course, everybody wants to be in the jets, so you occasionally get that one guy who's, oh, if I can't have the jets, nobody can, and so they just team kill up the wazoo and stuff like that. But, that gets really annoying, and when they're not working towards the objectives, you probably lose, especially if there's more people on your team going for the jets and such than on the enemy team. You're probably not going to have a good day with that. But the other thing that is a problem with the combined arms thing is the problem that was in Bad Company 2, where the vehicles were kind of overpowered. What I mean by that is, they take too many hits to go down, unless you're in another vehicle, and even then they take quite a few hits to go down. So, if you're infantry, you basically don't stand a chance against the armor. And you especially don't stand a chance against the helicopters, or the jets, which now have countermeasures, where if you fire a guided missile at them, where it's supposed to lock on, they can just fire their countermeasures, their flares, and guess what? You don't hit them. So that gets really annoying. So that's a pretty annoying problem in this game, where the vehicles themselves are kind of overpowered. You can play on maps without the vehicles, though, and so that's usually what I ended up doing, and that's not what Battlefield is supposed to be. So I feel like if they tweaked the vehicles just a bit, then it would make the combined arms gameplay just that much more enjoyable. But even when you're playing infantry only, there are problems. And these stem mostly from the unlock system. Now, an unlock system I inevitably have to compare to Call of Duty, but I also have to compare it to Bad Company 2, because that's where this thing really kicked off with the Battlefield series. Battlefield Bad Company 2 had an unlock system where if you played more as a class, you would get more points within that class. You would unlock things for it, like, say, for the Assault class in Bad Company 2. Eventually, you would unlock a red dot sight for all of your weapons, or you'd unlock different assault weapons that you could use. Well, assault class weapons, I should say, that you could use within that class. But in Battlefield 3, they decided to change that up. They still kept that system, so you still unlock different weapons or different bonuses or stuff like that by playing the different classes. But they didn't fix the problems that were within it, which, namely, the big one was with the medics in Bad Company 2. You had to unlock the defib. And you still have to do that in Battlefield 3, only instead of there being a medic class, you're the assault class now. So the assault class is now the medic. The engineer class is virtually unchanged. There's now a support class, which is your machine gunners mixed with your ammo box givers. which in Bad Company 2 they had the assault class do that. It was kind of weird. And then there's, of course, the recon class, which is pretty much unchanged as well. So they get sniper rifles and such. And the sniper rifles seem kind of underpowered in this game compared to how they were in Bad Company 2. Now, I think this was a reaction to Bad Company 2, where they were kind of overpowered, which was kind of annoying. But they decided to throw in this scope glint thing, where if you're using the long-range scopes with the sniper rifles in this game, then you actually get this scope glint, which is very, very noticeable. And so it makes you pretty easy to spot. So that's kind of weird. But back to the unlock system itself. Not only do you have to unlock stuff like the defib, but you unlock weapon attachments by using specific weapons. For instance, the US side starts with an M16A3. And if you use that, then at 10 kills you will get, I believe it's a heavy barrel, but I'm not 100% sure on that. That might be 20. No, 10 kills is an ACOG, sorry. And 50 is a red dot sight. So you get red dot sights on assault rifles at 50 kills. Whereas with carbines and submachine guns, you get them at 10. Same with shotguns. 10 kills on those weapons versus 50 on assault rifles. Why? And that's the real question I have with this thing. Why is anything the way it is? It's like they tried to balance out some things and then completely gave up on balancing everything else. Now, this is where I have to compare it to something like Call of Duty. The unlock system in Call of Duty makes much more sense than this, even though it still doesn't make a huge amount of sense. When you're leveling up your weapons in Call of Duty, for instance, you will find that they're very consistent. Like, you unlock a red dot sight at 25 kills in Call of Duty 4 for everything, except for sniper rifles, of course. So, it's very consistent as to what you unlock when you unlock it. And you know what to expect from it. With Battlefield 3, it doesn't really make any sense. It's just all over the place. Carbines start out with the first unlock being a red dot. It makes it much easier to use than the assault rifles, and the assault rifles are supposed to be the more moderate weapons, where you're supposed to be able to use them at much more varied circumstances than everything else. And what ends up happening is you see a lot of people running around as the assault class, and that's primarily because of a couple of things. One, the assault rifles are pretty much the best weapons in the game. They're the most well-rounded, they are good at pretty much all ranges, they're fairly easy to control for the most part, and you're going to be using them the most because they're just that fairly easy to use. The support class is not used as much because the LMGs are much, much harder to use. Same with the recon class, where the sniper rifles were pretty much nerfed when you actually went into this game. Unless you're playing in hardcore, they're pretty underpowered, actually. And then you see a lot of people playing the engineer as well, just because it's easier to unlock things for it. And that kind of unbalances the game. When you don't have people playing the specific roles that they're supposed to be playing the way they're actually supposed to be playing them, then you end up with a completely incoherent team that is just kind of running around playing Call of Duty Battlefield Edition. And it's weird, because when you actually get a competent team together who will actually work as a team, they will balance out their team with the proper loadout of classes and such, and work within those constraints. Like, you'll have one guy being the support, one guy being the medic assault character, one guy being the recon who's spotting everything, or setting up the spawn beacon. And then you have the engineer who's there to take out enemy vehicles or repair the team's vehicles and stuff like that. When you've got all of those guys working together, then you have that Battlefield experience. And that was one thing that was kind of lost with Bad Company 2. They didn't really plan that out all that well, and people kind of played it kind of like Call of Duty. And that's not what you're supposed to do with Battlefield. You're supposed to play Battlefield like Battlefield. And ever since Battlefield 2 and really 2142, the series has just gotten further and further away from that. In Battlefield 2, every class had a specific role. It was good for basically one thing and one thing only. And even though there was some versatility there, you still had people playing the classes the way they were supposed to be played, because there wasn't much other way to play them. In Battlefield 3, and of course Bad Company 2 and Bad Company 1 as well, there were the issues of people not playing the classes the way they're supposed to play them. They just kind of run around and do their own thing. And so what you end up having here is a much more individualistic game than the Battlefield series should be. You also have a game that is just not fun to play unless people are actually playing it the way it's supposed to be played, which very, very rarely happens. When you do get that team working together as this cohesive unit where you got the armor support and the air support working together with the infantry to capture points, and this chaos of war going around, it's enjoyable. It's rather fun to play. That almost never happens. Usually what happens is the game devolves into just complete chaos. And it's a real shame, because there's so many glimpses of what could have been in this game. You see things throughout the game. You see the destruction that could have been, even though they toned it down from Bad Company 2, which is kind of a shame. You see the efforts they made at trying to make things a bit more varied. Like, certain maps are very different from what you would see in, say, Bad Company 2, where the most different one being the one that everybody hates, which is Operation Metro. And that one has you fighting in a subway. And that's pretty unusual for this series. You also have the more Call of Duty-ification of it, where it's much more emphasis put on that unlock system, which makes the game outright unfair, because just good luck unlocking things when you've got people who've played the game for much longer than you, having all the unlocks for the weapons they've played with from the very beginning, and stuff like that. So, you have an incoherent mess of a game, which could have been really, really good, but they squandered it. And that's the real problem I have with this game. It's not that it takes a while to get used to how it plays. It's not that the origin problem. It's not battle log being a pain. It's that the game just isn't fun to play, because it's gotten so far from what made Battlefield great that it might as well just not even bear the Battlefield name anymore. It still has that combined arms gameplay. It still has that class-based gameplay, but it's so watered down from what I really liked with Battlefield 2 that I wondered why I even bothered with Battlefield 3. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.